people want and they deserve. Mr. President, I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
Senator from Missouri.
Mr. President, I want to follow right along with what my good friend, the senator from Texas, is talking about. And first, I'd like to say, one of the philosophies of government that I thought was so well stated in such a succinct way by Abraham Lincoln at the Cooper's Union in New York in 1860 was, he said, government should do for people only those things that people cannot better do for themselves. And there are some things in health care that government actually could do to then let people do things better for themselves. That's why our side, beginning in 2009 and before that, advocated things like buying across state lines, a bigger marketplace. Organize a marketplace. Don't try to operate a system. Don't try to create an environment where people can't make decisions about what they want and somehow we think the government can make those decisions better. We all talk to people every day who had coverage, as the senator from Texas said, that they were happy with, that met their needs, and now they are told by the government, well, your new coverage is better. It doesn't matter if you don't have any children. You have pediatric dental care. Doesn't matter if you're retired and plan not to have children. You now have maternity coverage. Doesn't matter if you've always had insurance. This covers people with pre-existing conditions. The American people have figured this out, and they don't like it. The system we had at the workplace-based insurance was largely a system that developed by accident after World War II, but interestingly, 85% of the people that had insurance got it at work, and 90% of them were happy with it. I think that's going to be the next thing we find out as we walk down the road, how many people are no longer going to get their insurance at work. But now we know the impact on people who generally didn't have insurance at work or have insurance the first time. I've got some stories here I want to share that people have contacted our office in the last few days and talked about, the few days since I was here a week ago, to talk about some stories I had then to tell that people are telling me. But just earlier today, another anecdotal evidence, somebody who at 27 left their family policy to get their own first insurance policy ever with the biggest insurance company in the country, went to the doctor they'd always gone to, and the doctor says, well, we don't, not the doctor, but the people, the receptionist, the people dealing with her said, we don't take that insurance here anymore. And then her request was, well, I want to see the doctor I've always seen. This is just, can I just pay cash? And the answer was, no, you can't pay cash, because we now know you have insurance, so under the new federal requirements, you can't pay cash to see the doctor you want to see. You've got to go somewhere that will take your insurance. Now, surely that's not what we all really intended to do. Those people here who voted against the bill, even those who, like me, voted for the bill, even those who, like me, spoke against it, would not have anticipated that one of the prohibitions would be that you couldn't pay cash to see the doctor you want to see because you find out that your insurance doesn't cover your doctor. This is actually a step beyond, if you like your doctor, you can keep your doctor. This goes to, if you're like your doctor, you can't even pay your doctor to see your doctor if the policies available to you didn't let you see your doctor. But, Mr. President, here are some letters I got just this week, and some email messages and some text messages, but all from Missourians. And even though I'm not going to give anybody's last name, these happen to all be Missourians that I think my staff has called and said, do you mind if we tell your story, just in case your neighbor figures out that this must be you if you're Christina from Lee's Summit, Missouri. But Christina says she's a single mother of two. She's working her way through school as a waitress, working 25 hours a week. She previously received insurance through her employer, but was not allowed to renew that plan. And now the cost of her daughter's deductible will go up from $100 a year to $2,500 a year, a 2,500% increase. As the senator from Texas says earlier, some of these deductibles for most families are like you don't have insurance at all. I don't know what Christina's situation is, but I know somewhere there's a 25-hour-a-week waitress with 2 kids that if they're told their deductible is $2,500, that means they really don't have any coverage, because they don't have $2,500, and they're not going to figure out how to get $2,500 and can't get insurance that makes that difference. Or Gina from Kansas City had a birth defect that eventually resulted in having to have her hip replaced and another revision to that. She has had health insurance every year of her life until this year. Her previous Blue Cross Blue Shield policies no longer available, and policies on the exchange were just too expensive. She says, at this rate, we won't be able to afford health insurance in our current situation. I want to go back to the old system. At least I know I have insurance and that I have my doctors too. My primary doctor, she says, retired due to the new health care plan. I've always had health insurance for me and my family. After 2014, I won't. Now, I wish that was an unusual letter, but it's not, and surely there's got to be people benefiting from the system. The law of averages would catch up with you. Somebody has to be having coverage they didn't have before, that maybe they couldn't get in the state high-risk pool. And by the way, we could have expanded those. That was one of the proposals I made for people who had a pre-existing condition. The biggest challenge to reality, I think, of this whole debate has been that nobody else had any other ideas, that this was the only set of ideas out there. I brought a list to the floor the other day of the 10 or 12 bills that I introduced as a House member. The biggest one was 75 pages long. One that, according to Harry Reid, Senator Reid, the majority leader, has accounted for 1/3 of the people that went on insurance because they were able to join their family's policy. I introduced that bill in the House. It was 4.5 pages. 4.5 pages. I guess if I'd been really good at this, and that was 1/3 of the people on, I could have come up with a bill that was about 12, 13 pages and just got everybody. We didn't need 2,700 pages of legislation. If 4.5 pages get 1/3 of the people that are now covered. But people, here's Mitchell in Weston, Missouri, said he still has insurance. His premiums go up over $40 a month. And frankly, that's one of the best stories I've had. Somebody that still has insurance and it's $40 a month higher. But he says this is not the answer for Americans with or without health insurance. This is now a national problem. He says, my health insurance is going up only $40 a month starting in January, but that's still, but the insurance now costs $120 a week for he and his wife. Said, most of my friends' rates are going up $100 and more a week. Now, I don't know that that's a scientific survey, but that's Mitchell's view of what's happening with most of his friends. Tony's a former owner of a hardware store. When he closed his store, he wasn't able to find insurance. Tony's from West Plains, Missouri. He enrolled in the Missouri State Insurance Pool, the high-risk pool. But when it was terminated, he was told to enroll in the Federal Health Exchange. I think he's finally gotten that done. He just says it happens to cost him more than it cost him before. Remember, the high-risk pool, here's what Tony says in his letter. When national health care became available, the legislature, this would be the Missouri legislature, I think this is what happened in most states, voted to end the Missouri high-risk pool effective December 31, 2013, and sent me a letter saying I'd have to enroll in the federal program. I began on the website the first week of October and made some attempt to enroll every day through October and November. I was finally successful in assessing the policy plans available just before December 1st. Now, here's another point I want to make too, Mr. Chairman. The rollout itself has had negative consequences on the makeup of people who have insurance. Now, I think there are many reasons that young, healthy people will decide not to buy insurance. One is that it costs them relatively more than it ever has before under the law. In December, in fact, if you were in your early 20s, you were paying about a fifth of what somebody was paying for health insurance in their early 60s. But in January, you had to pay at least a third of what somebody was paying in their early 60s. And the people's insurance in their early 60s didn't go down, but people's insurance in their early 20s went up. And I just had a dad today tell me, and besides that, you tell young people that, and you can get insurance if you have a serious health care problem, because there's no prohibition if you have pre-existing conditions. So if you're a young person, your insurance, this is the most uninsured group, young, healthy people who think they're young and healthy and probably don't need insurance because they're young and healthy, who should worry about an accident. I mean, I'm a dad. I understand how you have these discussions with, well, now wait a minute, that doesn't cover all your potential problems, but still, this is the biggest uninsured group, Mr. President, and they are not signing up, and part of why they're not signing up, one of the smaller reasons, there are fundamental problems with the plan itself, but believe me, if you're wondering if you should get insurance every day, you're not going to do what Tony did. You're not going to be on the website every single day from October 1 until December 1 until you get insurance. At some point, you're going to say, well, you know, I didn't really think I needed this anyway. I'm not going to keep beating my head against the wall to sign up for something that all my friends tell me is a bad deal and for sure is a worse deal than I would have gotten in December of last year, because the law insisted that it be a worse deal for young, healthy people. And the White House said last week that the number of people signed, when they were challenged about how the number of people signing up wasn't nearly enough, they said, well, really, I think the White House spokesman said it's not the number of people, it's the mix of people that really matters. And I think the number they've had out there is about 40% of the people that sign up need to be under 35 and hopefully healthy, and that number is about 25%. So the mix isn't working, the number isn't working, the cost isn't working. According to Sean from Independence, his premiums for his private policy went up 40%. If he elected to drop his private policy and sign up on the exchange, according to him, his premiums and deductibles would more than double, and he wouldn't qualify for any subsidies. So for Sean, the best deal was the 40% increase. He had a more than 100% increase if he went to the exchange and higher deductibles. Lynn from Farmington, Missouri, says that at Mineral Area Regional Medical Center, premiums increased even more than usual due to the Affordable Care Act requirements. We have increased the employees' portion of the health insurance premium in order to increase deductibles and co-pays due to the ACA-required new coverage that every plan has to include. Barbara at Fulton, Missouri, where Winston Churchill gave the famous Iron Curtain speech at Westminster College in Fulton, says her husband's Blue Cross Blue Shield plan was canceled because it was deemed, this is her quote, illegal per the Affordable Care Act. Her family, her husband and 2 daughters, is now paying more money for health insurance. My husband had insurance he liked, and when we received a letter from Blue Cross Blue Shield that his plan was going to be discontinued due to requirements of the Affordable Care Act, they were disappointed. I was also told that my 4-year-old child could apply for state Medicaid, and my 9-year-old child earned too much to qualify for insurance through healthcare.gov. They qualify for neither of these programs, she says, because of, per quote, because of Obamacare, we as a family are paying much more for health insurance for our children and my husband is not currently fully insured. And my last letter, Mr. President, is from Scott in Independence, Missouri, who says his employer dropped his retiree health plan for 2014 due to increased costs associated with ACA. I don't see here who his employer was, but we've seen big employers. IBM dropped their retiree health plan. UPS dropped their health care for all of the spouses and dependents of their employees, in both cases saying, well, now you've got somewhere to go. You need to go to the exchange rather than the plan that you had as part of being a retiree or part of being a spouse of someone who worked here. Scott looked at plans for on the exchange, and for a plan that is worse than what he had under his employer, he will pay 280% more in premiums, and his out-of-pocket expenses, I guess that means deductibles, will quadruple. 4 times the deductibles, 280% the premiums. He says essentially, let me read one other thing here. He talks about being a disabled veteran. Since I'm also a disabled veteran and exempt from the ACA, I went to see what my cost would be for a policy for just my 9-year-old daughter. Unfortunately, I can't enroll her unless I enroll, so my cost will go from $159 for a Cadillac policy to $459 per month for his description, a horrible ACA policy this year. Essentially, I was forced to buy a policy I neither want or need. It'll cost me far more and provide far less than my canceled employer plan. Bigger marketplace with more choices, more ways to ensure you can take your insurance from one place of work to another, more ways to ensure that expanded high-risk pools would let people join those high-risk pools. And by the way, if you're an insurance company and you have to participate in that in some way, at least you know that all the other insurance companies are too, and everybody in that group is somebody who had a pre-existing condition, as opposed to having to assume you're going to get less healthy people than hopefully you get. Mr. President, I just say that everybody in the country and everybody in the Congress knows more about health care than most people did 5 years ago. I think it'd be a good time for us to take all that new knowledge about health care and see if we couldn't look at this again and do a better job. And, Mr. President, I yield back.
Mr. President.
Senator from Rhode Island.
Mr. President, may I ask unanimous consent to speak as if in morning business for about 15 minutes?
Without objection.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. I'm back now for the 55th time that the Senate has been in session each week to urge my colleagues to wake up to the toll that carbon pollution is taking on our atmosphere, on our oceans, and on our people. While climate change deniers continue to gin up phony doubt to mislead the public, top American businesses and corporations recognize the risks posed by climate change. They are preparing for the economic fallout. Members of Congress bury their heads in the sand like the proverbial ostrich, hoping the issue will go away, wondering in some cases recently whether the recent cold front disproves decades of research and an overwhelming scientific consensus. Well, business leaders in the real world, not the political world, not the polluter-paid, phony doubt world, business leaders in the real world are doing what they do best, and that is taking steps to protect their bottom line and maintain their relationships with their customers. Major corporations, even those with large carbon footprints, are taking voluntary action to lower their own carbon output. Some are joining broader efforts to support policies that reduce carbon emissions. Some of our largest and most sophisticated companies are even factoring the economic burden of climate change into their own accounting and their own long-term planning by, guess what, assigning an internal price to carbon. The bicameral task force on climate change, which I lead with Congressman Waxman, wrote to over 300 businesses and organizations seeking their views on actions the federal government could take to reduce carbon pollution and to strengthen our resiliency to climate change. The response from the business community was very encouraging. Some examples. Coca-Cola, headquartered in Georgia, wrote this, I quote, "We recognize climate change is a critical challenge facing our planet, with potential impacts on biodiversity, water resources, public health, and agriculture. Beyond the effects on the communities we serve, we view climate change as a potential business risk, understanding that it could likely have direct and indirect effects on our business." That's Coca-Cola. Texas and Maryland-based Lockheed Martin told the task force of the major headway it has made in reducing its greenhouse gas emissions. And I'll quote from Lockheed Martin. From 2007 through 2011, Lockheed Martin reduced its absolute carbon emissions by 30% and continues to focus on carbon emission reductions by championing energy conservation and efficiency measures in our facilities. Lockheed Martin. Let's look at Walmart. Founded and headquartered in Arkansas, Walmart wrote, "We're committed to reducing our carbon footprint, and we're working with our suppliers to do the same." Indeed, I met yesterday with the general counsel from Apple, doing exactly the same thing, working to reduce their carbon footprint, working with their suppliers to push for reductions on the part of their suppliers. Walmart's 2009 sustainability report shows its long-standing commitment to fighting climate change. Here's what Walmart said. "Climate change may not cause hurricanes, but warmer ocean water can make them more powerful. Climate change may not cause rainfall, but it can increase the frequency and severity of heavy flooding. Climate change may not cause droughts, but it can make droughts longer." Every company has a responsibility to reduce greenhouse gases as quickly as it can. That's Walmart. That's why we are working in a number of areas, they continue, to reduce our company's carbon footprint, and also working with our suppliers and customers to help them do the same. Currently, we are investing in renewable energy, increasing energy efficiency in our buildings and trucks, working with suppliers to take carbon out of products, and supporting legislation in the U.S. to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. That's Walmart. And I also want to commend the Walmart Foundation, the Family Foundation, for the work they're doing on oceans, as well as on the atmospheric aspects of carbon. Let's look at Mars, the Virginia-based candy company. Mars states, "We are committed to reducing our greenhouse gas emissions in absolute terms because this is the right thing to do. As climate change has implications for the production of agricultural ingredients, addressing it requires changes to the way we source materials and manufacture our products." Mars, maker of the famous Mars bars and M&Ms. North Carolina's VF Corporation, which makes major apparel brands like Lee and Wrangler and Nautica and North Face, says this, "We seek to conduct our business with the highest levels of honesty, integrity, and respect. These values are embedded in our approach to sustainability, which reflects our commitment to operating our business so future generations can live with cleaner water and air, healthier forests and oceans, and a stable climate." Toy maker Hasbro from my home state of Rhode Island has issued its energy pledge. "Climate change mitigation is a pressing global issue," it reads, "and we aim to reduce our corporate carbon footprint by improving energy efficiency and reducing greenhouse gas emissions at our sites." Hasbro, by the way, was awarded a Climate Leadership Award by the EPA in 2012 for excellence in greenhouse gas management. These companies and their products are household names in this country. They're major players in the American economy. Lockheed Martin had annual revenue in 2012 of over $47 billion. We trust them with some of our most important defense contracts. Coke topped $48 billion and may be the most recognizable corporate franchise in the world. Walmart is the world's second largest company with 2012 revenue of more than $443 billion. Mr. President, these are serious companies, and they are serious about their products, and they are serious about their returns. And in part, they earn their impressive returns by being serious about science. And they understand the harm that carbon-driven climate change causes. They see the unfair advantage that big polluters get when those big polluters don't have to factor the costs of their carbon pollution into the price of the coal or oil. That's why more and more leading businesses are calling on Congress to wake up and set new ground rules to even the energy playing field. Mars and VF Corporation, along with eBay, Gap, Levi's, Nike, Starbucks, and other name-brand American corporations, are members of the Business for Innovative Climate and Energy Policy Coalition, BICEP, which is pushing for energy policies that will draw down carbon emissions and boost economic growth. BICEP is just one of the impressive initiatives organized by Ceres, a nonprofit organization that helps to mobilize investors and business leaders to build a sustainable global economy. If we in Congress are willing to take on these special interests, the polluting special interests that keep Congress barricaded, BICEP member companies and others will have our back. What we need to do is to price carbon properly, to get a right price for carbon. That means making the big carbon polluters pay a fee to the American people to cover the cost of dumping their waste into our atmosphere and oceans. That's a cost they now push off happily onto the rest of us. Well, because of the political control of the polluters over Congress, conditions do not presently allow us to price carbon. So, Senator Boxer and those in our new Senate Climate Action Task Force are pushing to change those political conditions. While we do that, and we will do that because we have the public and the facts and the science and the imperative, both moral and practical, on our side, but while we're doing that, these companies, these big name brand American companies, have begun to assess their own internal prices on carbon. A recent report by the Climate Disclosure Project, which gauges carbon emissions and energy use of major corporations, has identified 29 large companies that use internal carbon prices in their operations or their long-term planning. Some of these companies price carbon to drive energy efficiency. Others see it as a smart way to prepare their business practices for the likelihood of a national American carbon fee. Among those companies are some of the world's largest oil and gas companies, as well as major energy consumers. Some examples: ExxonMobil estimates that a price of $60 per metric ton of carbon dioxide will be assessed on carbon by 2030. BP's figure is $40, and Devon Energy's is $15. Some of the biggest carbon emitters in history are preparing for a price on carbon. Let that sink in for a second. The emitters have already baked into their planning a price on carbon, among other reasons because they know it's the right outcome. Who else is using internal carbon pricing? Well, Google assesses an internal carbon fee of $14 per metric ton that it uses to invest in green initiatives. Likewise, Microsoft charges each of its organizational divisions a quarterly carbon-neutral fee of $6 to $7 per metric ton. The revenue from those divisions for that carbon fee goes, very similar to Google, to a central fund to support carbon offset projects. Microsoft even published a carbon fee playbook as a guide for businesses looking to establish their own internal carbon fees. Walt Disney Company, talk about a nameplate company. Walt Disney charges its subsidiary businesses a carbon fee based on their share of the company's overall footprint. The higher the carbon footprint, according to a company statement, the more they pay. We have built this into our capital planning process as well, says Disney. So businesses have to take the price of carbon into account while planning new projects. The additional operational cost, Disney says, has started to incentivize businesses to seek methods to reduce their impact. Walmart ran the numbers, assuming an economy-wide carbon fee of $18 per ton. The company finds, and I quote, Walmart's early action on emission reductions represents a competitive advantage. Walmart says their action on emissions gives them a competitive advantage over other retailers that have not performed such projects. Investors, who are behind a lot of these companies, are also voicing concerns about the exposure of their portfolios to the effects of climate change, and they are pushing for climate action. The Carbon Asset Risk Initiative, also coordinated by Ceres, is a coalition of 70 investors worth nearly $3 trillion. They've pressured 45 of the world's top fossil fuel companies to disclose the climate risks that are facing their investments in those companies. Should the oil and gas interests prove, shall we say, evasive in answering? Well, investors may soon have other resources at hand to evaluate the climate risk to their portfolios. Bloomberg News, for example, has developed for its readers the Bloomberg Carbon Risk Valuation Tool, a model which can describe the potential effect of carbon regulations on fossil fuel company earnings and share price. Mr. President, investors and corporate executives take climate change seriously because of how they see it will hurt the bottom line and because of how it will affect their relationship with their customers. They get it, Mr. President. Big, nameplate American corporations get it. Unlike this building and this institution and the one down the hall, the Congress of the United States, the House of Representatives, which remain under the control and thrall of the polluting interests and won't take action like these big leadership nameplate American corporations already have. We can work with those big corporations. We have got to work with them to break the campaign of polluter-paid denial that has Congress barricaded. That campaign of denial is as poisonous to our democracy as the underlying carbon pollution is to our atmosphere and oceans. We need to clean them both up. We need a democracy that is clean of polluter-paid denial, and we need atmosphere and oceans that are clean of polluter-emitted carbon. It is time to push back on the misleading propaganda of the polluters. It is time to recognize that our allies are out there to work with us. It is time for us to wake up. Mr. President, I thank you, and I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
The senator from Alaska.
Mr. President, I had an opportunity early last week to give a speech at the Brookings Institution about the United States' significant opportunity when it comes to energy production and our opportunity as a nation to expand our energy trade. And I was able to present this speech based on a white paper that I have recently released. It's entitled A Signal to the World, Renovating the Architecture of U.S. Energy Exports. This builds on a document that I presented to this body, to my colleagues, to really folks who cared about any aspect of what's going on within the energy industry within our country and our energy opportunities. It's a document that I entitled Energy 2020. It was 115 pages of not legislation, but really concepts, discussion points, areas where I feel that we as a nation have an opportunity to lead when it comes to our energy potential. And when we talk about energy in our country, it's really easy to talk about kind of all of the above. But I really did make a very concerted effort to address all forms of energy that we in this country are blessed to have, whether it's our traditional fossil fuels, our oil, our natural gas, our coal resources, whether it's the enormous potential that we have with our renewable fuel sources such as wind and solar and geothermal and ocean energy, marine hydrokinetic, our hydropower, the opportunities that present themselves with our biofuels, the importance, the great significance of nuclear within our energy portfolio. And so I didn't want that document to just be yet another document that somebody produces, some good ideas that are thrown out there to just founder. So I have been working to present a series of these white papers. Had an opportunity to present one several months back on natural gas. Now, this week, it is a paper on the architecture, again, of U.S. energy exports. In several weeks, I plan on introducing yet another. So I've come to the floor this afternoon to share my thoughts on energy exports with the Senate, all energy exports, and to enter my recommendations on this important subject into the congressional record. My point, again, is not to trot out legislation in one area or another, but as a nation, to have us focus on our energy potential, and again, all of our energy potential, and our opportunity to utilize this energy potential to share this amazing wealth that we have, whether it is within our traditional fuels or whether it is within our renewables or our non-traditional, but to really focus on what it means as a nation to be a nation that enjoys energy abundance rather than a nation that faces energy scarcity. And I think it's fair to say that for far too long, the conversation has been based from a position of energy scarcity. It's time to change that focus. It's time to shift that dialogue, that debate, to how do we perform, how do we operate, how do we take advantage of our relative abundance. Now, before I start my comments and kind of summarize my white paper and the speech that I gave, I'd like to pause for a quick note. This is the cover of my white paper, which will form the basis for my remarks today. I chose a U.S. Navy photograph that was taken aboard the USS Carl Vinson. It was taken by Mass Communications Specialist 2nd Class James R. Evans, I want to make sure that he gets proper credit for the photograph, because as I look at it, it gives me the sense of optimism that I think that we should all have about the future of our energy trade. I think that future is bright. I think it's promising. So let's start the discussion by looking exactly at the opportunity that we do have before us. Simply put, the United States is both producing and exporting more energy now than ever before. We are producing and we are exporting more than we ever have before. Net energy imports are at a 20-year low and projected to fall below 5% of total consumption by the year 2025. Now, to put this into perspective, when I came here to the United States Senate, we were importing about 60% of our oil at that time. Net energy imports now at a 20-year low, projected to fall below 5% of total consumption by 2025. So this is all energy imports. Energy exports are reducing our trade deficit. They're boosting American commerce around the world. We've been talking all this week and last about unemployment insurance, how we can work to really improve the economy for those that lack jobs or are underemployed. Let me tell you, Mr. President, this is an area of opportunity when it comes to our energy production. So energy exports are helping us with our trade deficit, and they're boosting commerce and jobs. But the regulatory architecture, the framework that we're operating in that governs energy exports, is really antiquated. It goes back to acts that were passed in the 30s, in the 50s, in the 70s, and furthermore, they're applied unevenly across the sector. So my white paper proposes a series of recommendations to renovate our nation's approach to energy trade and strengthen America's global posture. And I know, Mr. President, that around here, when you put an idea out on the floor, you also put a target on your back. But I think this is an important discussion for us to have. So again, we're not proffering legislation, but what I am pushing, what I am going to edge my colleagues towards, is a greater discussion about energy and energy exports. Now, the first resource that I wrote about in my white paper was coal. I think we have to acknowledge these are some pretty uncertain times for truly what has been the backbone of the U.S. energy supply. Coal is projected to remain the top source of electricity for the next 2 decades, but we know that it faces competition from other energy sources. There's clearly a regulatory effort that will make the construction of new plants an extremely difficult endeavor. But I think you can see here that net exports of coal, though they're at their highest level on record and as a share of their production, they're really at their highest level in 30 years here now. Exports of coal are presently free of burdensome regulations. I think that they should remain so. I think that our federal regulatory agencies should not require climate change studies in the course of their permitting process for any proposed facilities. And I say this because coal is going to be consumed around the world regardless of U.S. trade policy. We know that, we see that, we can point to the countries where they're seeing increased coal imports. The only question here, the real question that we're talking about, is whether or not the coal is produced here in North America. And if it's produced here in North America, the environmental standards are going to be higher than they will elsewhere. So the real question is, do you produce it where you have stronger environmental standards, or are you going to get it from countries where their environmental standards are held to a lower level? The next resource that we're talking about is natural gas. Great deal of discussion of late about natural gas. North America is quickly emerging as one of the world's most important hubs for the natural gas trade. Record levels are flowing to Mexico and Canada via pipeline. The build-out of seaborne export capacity, which requires the liquefaction of gas for onloading onto cargo ships, I think is proceeding too slow under the Department of Energy's watch. Other nations are approving capacity, they're securing financing, they're building projects, and they're contracting with customers. They're making these long-term contracts ahead of the United States. So a little more in-depth on this particular resource area, building on the white paper here. I think that DOE should expedite its review process for applications to export LNG to non-FTA countries. The last time that an application was approved was back in mid-November. It's over 2 months ago now. I don't see the reason for continued delay here. I do think that we have to monitor the role of the other agencies that are involved in this. We have the FERC, we have the Maritime Administration, we have the Pipeline and Hazardous Materials Safety Administration. I think it's important to understand whether or not this process is as streamlined and as functional as it should be. Now, there are some who are suggesting that there needs to be a pause button pushed here, whether it's at DOE, at the FERC, or any other agency. No new study should be commissioned, as the nearest study from 2012 I think is more than adequate. I think DOE has access to all the latest EIA and the other market data when it issues its orders. Our allies overseas and American workers here at home, I think, have waited long enough. We can do more, and we can do it in an expedited manner. The third area are natural gas liquids. A variety of fuels are produced alongside oil and gas as part of the energy renaissance underway here in this country. You have butane, propane, you've got pentanes plus. These are known as natural gas liquids. And they've got various uses. They've not typically represented a major source of either revenue or volume to American exporters. And since the energy renaissance has begun, we have seen exports of more of these products on the uptake. We've seen them surge. The regulatory structure that surrounds NGL export, I think, are working pretty well. They're working smoothly. I don't think that they require modification. Trade in these products plays a valuable role in reducing volatility and creating additional demand to stimulate production. Now, next is the issue of crude oil and condensates. Obviously, generates a little more interest and discussion, and that's okay, because again, I want to have this discussion. We are producing more oil in this country today than at any point in the past 20 years. And what has happened is this increase has resulted in a plethora of what's known as light, tight oil. And this is coming from the Bakken, from the Eagle Ford, and for other plays around the country. And this crude is lighter and sweeter than the U.S. refinery system was really built to accommodate. So existing capacity, upgrades to existing refineries, and logistical feats to transport that light crude to appropriate refiners on the East Coast instead of over on the Gulf Coast where you have the heavy refining capacity where that dominates. These have allowed for new volumes of light crude to be refined and brought to global markets as product. So you have a situation where under existing regulations, the Department of Commerce may license the export of crude oil under certain conditions, most notably if that oil is destined for Canada. But in addition, you have large amounts of condensate, other hydrocarbon that cannot be exported. And these are also being produced along with record levels of crude and natural gas. Now, many producers fear that rising light crude production will soon exceed not only our light refining capacity, but also the ability of our refiners to adapt to the new production slate. And so when this point is reached, when this mismatch occurs, the U.S. oil resurgence, I think, collides with the de facto ban that we have on crude oil exports. Now, you're going to hear people say, you're going to hear the opponents argue that lifting the ban is somehow or other going to increase the price of gasoline. Well, coming from a state where we have probably some of the highest gas prices at the pump anywhere. That's not my interest. That's clearly not my interest. But I think that there's a number of sound economic reasons why this is not going to be the case. First, gasoline is a petroleum product, and petroleum products are subject to global pricing, just like crude oil. So to the extent that greater U.S. production of crude oil puts downward pressure on the international oil prices, then production increases have benefited U.S. consumers by marginally lowering the gasoline and the crude oil prices. American consumers are already generally paying a global price for petroleum products, including gasoline, and would also benefit to the extent that lifting the ban on crude oil exports would send a positive signal to oil producers to then increase production. Second point here is the cost of inaction. Prohibitions on the free trade of any product, with all things being equal, increases the prices, it creates market distortions, it leads to misallocation of capital, and it has a deleterious impact on job creation. So to the extent that the crude oil export ban contributes to supply disruptions and decelerating oil production, which affects unemployment, then the American consumer suffers these consequences. So I have taken the position that the status quo does not benefit the American consumer. In fact, not acting could actually negatively impact the nation. All sectors of the U.S. oil industry are global leaders. Upstream, you have American technology and expertise that enables the growth in production. Midstream, you have a complex network of pipelines that transports that oil across the country safely every day. And then, of course, downstream, you have American refiners who are among the most advanced in the world. So lifting the de facto ban will strengthen this system by protecting jobs, boosting production, and enhancing efficiency and specialization. Now, I mentioned the Commerce Department earlier. They may retain sufficient statutory authority to lift the ban on its own as part of a larger swap. Now, some have suggested trading U.S. light crude for Mexican heavy, which sounds interesting, but it's a little more complicated than that. The President may also make a national interest determination that the present regulatory structure, which generally prohibits crude oil exports, is unnecessary and counterproductive. White House action on this matter is of course, the shortest way from point A to point B, and if the President is so inclined, he can call me. He'd count on my full support on this. If the White House disagrees with this interpretation of its authority, or it chooses to maintain the prohibition on exports, then I think it would be appropriate for this body, for the Senate, to update the laws to reflect 21st century conditions. Now, after crude oil and condensates is the growing success story of our petroleum products and their exports. An enormous expansion of the American export profile in global petroleum product markets has accompanied the crude oil resurgence. Exports of petroleum products must continue without burdensome regulations. The U.S. refining industry is the global leader and delivers gasoline, diesel, and other fuel to American friends and allies around the world. These fuels will be consumed whether or not they're imported from the U.S., which, again, uses the strictest environmental standards. And then, of course, when we're talking about energy production and our opportunities for exports, there is our renewable energy resource. There's renewable technology. Producers of wind turbines, solar panels, and other renewable technologies also help reduce the U.S. trade deficit through our exports. So again, very important to make sure that when we're talking about energy exports, let's truly talk about all of them, including our renewable technologies. I think that the general lack of trade restrictions on renewable energy technology products doesn't need to be modified. If renewable technology is the future, then it needs to be competitive. And then finally, the last area is nuclear technology. The United States has been the undisputed leader of nuclear technology throughout the world. We produce more nuclear power than any other nation. And as the global nuclear trade has developed, what we've seen is that the U.S. market share there has declined. I think that the federal government must continue its efforts to help develop small modular reactors. And I think that we can do this without putting international security at risk or violating nonproliferation controls. Mr. President, the energy resurgence has fueled a beneficial expansion of U.S. energy trade. And the evidence is clear that exports can help facilitate enhanced production by opening up U.S. supply to global markets. Trade is creating jobs, it's increasing supply, it's enhancing our nation's security, without doubt. Competition and efficiency are the strengths of the American economy system. They're not defects. Trade and consumption will occur with or without us. So the question here is whether or not we can enhance or whether we will demote our global position. And to the extent that American-made energy can displace other less clean sources, then the global environment will benefit from enhanced U.S. trade. People come first, though. We recognize that. The nation's opportunity to help us alleviate energy policy is one that we should not miss. I believe, Mr. President, that we need to send a powerful signal to the world that the U.S. is ready to reassert its role as a leader on energy, the environment, and trade. And to me, that is a signal worth sending. And so, as I've said, this is a debate worth having here in the Senate, here in this new year. And I look forward to joining my colleagues. I know that there are many who, on the other side, who have differing views when it comes to our fossil fuels. But I think that we would find alignment in other areas when we were talking about our energy exports and our great potential. So as we are trying to build our nation's economy, as we are trying to strengthen jobs across the country, let us not forget the enormous potential, the enormous growth potential that we hold when it comes to our energy production and potential for energy export. With that, Mr. President, I thank you for your attention, and I yield the floor.
Senator from Ohio. Always appreciate the comments of Senator Murkowski, who is always thoughtful and works across the aisle as well as anyone here, and I appreciate the work that she does. I rise briefly to joining with Senator Blumenthal of Connecticut and Senator Merkley, who is now in the presiding officer's chair, but will be joining us to mark the 50th anniversary of U.S. Surgeon General Dr. Terry's groundbreaking report on the dangers of smoking. 387-page report released 5 decades ago concluded something that was almost revolutionary at its time and was revolutionary in its impact. It said cigarette smoking is a health hazard of sufficient importance in the United States to warrant appropriate remedial action. We know how our views in this country have changed about smoking, but we also know one other thing. 400,000 people every year die from smoking-related illnesses. And you know what that says, Mr. President? That says that the tobacco companies have to find 400,000 new customers every year. And the people they try to seduce into smoking are not people my age, they're the Page's age, or even younger than the Pages in this body. Those are the people that they aim at to teach them to start smoking, if you will. And it's not just young people that they're trying to get addicted to smoking, the tobacco companies. It's also what they're doing in the developing world. I was in Poland in 1991 working for Ohio State University right after the communist government in Poland fell. First billboards all over Warsaw, all over Krakow, all over Lublin in eastern Poland. First billboards were tobacco, mostly American tobacco companies also, if I recall British tobacco companies. Those were the first billboards that were up. We also know that the tobacco companies, as they try to seduce young people in our country to smoke, they've in some sense attacked the third world, the developing world, to get people to smoke there. One of the ways they've done this, Mr. President, is by using our trade agenda to weaken public health laws in other countries. Some developing countries, some poor countries have enacted public health anti-smoking laws, and the U.S. tobacco companies and tobacco companies from other countries have tried to weaken, sometimes successfully, those laws. It's important that we close loopholes in our trade agenda that allow big tobacco corporations to undermine these global health standards. This administration's decision not to exclude any one product, including tobacco, from the Trans-Pacific Partnership, a proposed trade agreement among the U.S. and 11 other countries, is a disappointment. It opens up years of anti-tobacco public health policies to attacks by big tobacco, because under the TPP's investor state provisions, tobacco companies could challenge public health laws in the U.S. and abroad, all under the guise of, in the name of, free trade. A record number of investor state cases were filed last year, according to the UN Conference on Trade and Development. So we know, Mr. President, the public health campaign against tobacco continues in our country, and people like Senator Blumenthal have been a leader in this for well over a decade. And it extends to our international politics, our international trade regimen. We have a lot of work to do. That's why I'm pleased to join Senator Blumenthal and Senator Merkley in their discussion today honoring the 50th anniversary of Dr. Terry's report. I yield to Senator Blumenthal.
Mr. President. Mr. President.
The Senator from Connecticut.
Thank you, Mr. President. I'm proud to be with public health advocates like the presiding officer